He thought I'd stay silent, that I'd smile politely while he paraded his affair in front of the very people who toasted to our marriage just last year. But when he brought his mistress to the biggest party of the year, the one I helped plan, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I arrived late, arm in arm with the man he hated most. And when my husband saw me, he gasped. That was the beginning of his end. Because I wasn't just there to make a statement. I was there to ruin him. I was always the background to his spotlight. The supportive wife in designer gowns he picked, the perfect hostess to his clients, the silent force behind his company's success. And he was Edward Whitmore. Charming. Powerful. A venture capitalist with a silver tongue and a diamond-studded ego. We met when I was a struggling interior architect. He said he loved my ambition, my vision. He invested in my dreams, or so I thought. In reality, he buried them under his. Soon, I was designing his spaces, living in his world, and fading from my own. The night everything began to crack was the company gala. A celebration of a major merger. I had styled the entire venue. Every table arrangement, lighting setup, even the scent wafting through the air, it had my touch. Yet when I entered the ballroom, I felt like a stranger in my own creation. Edward stood near the center stage, surrounded by investors, smiling like the king of the world. And beside him, her. Tall. Blonde. Wearing the same custom atelier dress I'd once worn to his birthday 2 years ago. Samantha Blake. His junior associate. 24. All red lips and youthful arrogance. And she clung to him like a trophy he was proud to display. My husband introduced her to the crowd not as an employee, but as his date. That word. Date. It twisted through my stomach like glass shards. People whispered. Eyes darted toward me. A few sympathetic, most entertained. I held my posture, smiled at the server offering champagne, and walked right past the man who used to be my world. He had told me earlier that day he had to fly to Chicago. Emergency investor meeting. Turns out, the only emergency was my dignity, and it was burning. I left the ballroom quietly that night. But I didn't leave defeated. I went home to the penthouse we still shared, though only legally, and opened the safe. I hadn't touched the documents in months. But now, I laid them all out. The contracts, the prenup, the business shares I still held in our joint ventures. And I made a plan. Because Edward had just made one mistake too many. 3 years ago, Edward made me co-founder of his real estate expansion brand, Everly Designs. It was a gift, he said, for believing in him before his first million. I was ecstatic. He didn't know I'd quietly made copies of everything I signed. Nor did he know I recorded conversations. Habit, from years of dealing with high-profile clients who lied as easily as they breathed. And now, those recordings would be gold. Especially the one where he admitted to overinflating project estimates and bribing a zoning official for permits. All said over wine. All clear as day. But revenge is best served when no one sees it coming. The next week, I booked an appointment with Vincent Hale, Edward's biggest rival. Vincent and Edward had once been college friends turned competitors. Vincent now ran Hale Ventures. Sleeker, smarter, and leaner. The two men couldn't be in the same room without circling like wolves. And now, Vincent would be my partner. I wasn't there to seduce him. I was there to strike a deal. I'm not here for pity, I told him, sipping espresso across from him in his glass-walled office. I'm here to hand you Edward's empire on a silver platter. You just need to hold the knife. Vincent leaned forward, amused. Why now? I smiled. Because it's personal. He agreed. We worked in secret, moving chess pieces where Edward would never look. Under my name, I launched a new boutique design firm, Valor Interiors, funded quietly by Hale Ventures. My name had vanished from Edward's lips, but it was about to light up every design magazine he pretended to respect. And then came the event. A high-profile charity gala. Edward was on the hosting committee. All the names that mattered in the real estate and investment world would be there. And so would I. Not as his wife, but as the woman he thought he could bury. I wore crimson. Not a dull maroon or polite burgundy. No, it was a molten, unapologetic red. The kind of red that stops conversations. The kind of red that makes people forget decorum. And beside me? Vincent Hale. Impeccably dressed. Unapologetically mine. for the night. We entered 20 minutes late. The room fell into a hush. Edward stood near the champagne tower, mid-toast. His mouth parted, his words stalled. I held his gaze and smiled. And then leaned into Vincent's ear and whispered something that made him laugh loud enough for the whole room to turn. Edward's face drained of color. Samantha blinked beside him, confused. I walked past them both, not offering even a nod. The photographers turned. People murmured. This wasn't just an entrance. It was a declaration. You do not humiliate a woman like me and walk away untouched. That night was only the beginning. Vincent would soon announce a strategic acquisition. Everly Designs was floundering, he'd claim. My anonymous tip to the press about Edward's bribery scandal would hit the headlines the next morning. His empire would tremble. But tonight? Tonight, he had to watch me shine. Watch me laugh with the man he hated. Watch me loved by the city he once ruled. I didn't need to scream. My silence was louder. And when he reached out to speak to me, eyes pleading, I simply walked past. Justice, I realized, isn't always served in courtrooms. Sometimes, it walks in wearing red. Holding the hand of your worst nightmare. After the gala, everything moved faster than even I had anticipated. The whispers didn't die down. If anything, they multiplied. The press didn't just talk about Edward's gala anymore. They talked about me. Mysterious red-dressed woman with Hale Ventures CEO. Is Vincent Hale off the market? Edward Whitmore's estranged wife makes bold statement. Is there a business war brewing? I didn't give interviews. I didn't need to. Every photo of me beside Vincent did the work for me. And Edward? He was unraveling behind closed doors. I knew him too well. I knew the vein on his neck would throb when he saw me trending. Knew he'd call his PR manager, his lawyers, his assistants. Searching for a way to control a narrative that was already slipping through his fingers. But this wasn't just about headlines. This was about dismantling the illusion that he had built. A perfect husband, a self-made man, a loyal businessman. Every inch of it had my fingerprints behind the scenes. But he had treated me like wallpaper. Pleasant to look at but easily replaced. Now, I was the architect of his collapse. 3 weeks after the gala, Hale Ventures, under Vincent's leadership, launched a surprise bid to acquire several properties managed by Edward's firm. Properties I had designed, zoned, and knew inside out. The board was intrigued. Investors shifted uneasily. Edward had no idea I had spent the last month feeding Vincent every operational weakness, every document that exposed the shortcuts he took. And then the first domino fell. An article dropped. It was anonymous, but the source was credible. Bribery in the skyline. Did Whitmore Enterprises pay off officials to push through luxury projects? It included exact dates, locations, and even referenced emails between Edward and a zoning official. Of course, the emails had come from my encrypted backup. He had once laughed, "You keep everything like a lawyer prepping for court." I smiled back then. Now I was grateful. Edward's team scrambled to control the story. Denials. Statements. Legal threats. But the city launched an investigation within days. And Vincent? He pounced. He offered to buy out one of Edward's stalled projects, at half its value, promising to restore public trust and rebuild with integrity. It was a masterstroke. The media loved it. I stayed silent. But every time Vincent made a move, the world saw a glimpse of the woman beside him, the one Edward once called his quiet little designer. Behind the business war, Edward was slipping on a personal level too. My sources inside his company, loyal assistants who had seen too much, told me about the fights. With Samantha. With the board. With himself. Samantha had started demanding a public commitment. "You promised we'd move in together," she said in one recorded phone call. "You said she was out of the picture." Oh, how little she knew. He hadn't even served me divorce papers. Why would he? As long as I was still legally tied to him, half his assets were still tangled with mine. And now, he couldn't afford to cut me loose. I wanted him to feel that trap. The slow, suffocating pressure of a cage he built for himself. I started sending back his letters unopened. Ignored his calls. And when he finally came to my office unannounced, hair disheveled, eyes desperate, I didn't even offer him a seat. "I made a mistake," he said, voice low. I met his gaze, cool and unblinking. "Which one?" He flinched. You don't have to do this, he continued. You're not like this. This isn't who you are. I smiled, leaning forward. You don't get to define who I am anymore, Edward. That version of me? The one who begged for your time, for your love, for scraps of your attention? She died the night you brought your mistress to our event. I didn't know you'd be there, he muttered. Oh, that's right, I said sharply. You lied to my face about being in Chicago. You assumed I'd stay home. Humiliated. Broken. Out of sight. He looked down. But I was never weak. I was just silent. And that silence? That's what let you think you could get away with it. He stood there, like a child caught stealing, like a king stripped of his crown. I want to fix this, he said. I walked to the door and opened it. So did I. And then I shut it behind him. Edward's empire was bleeding. Slowly. Publicly. Clients pulled out. Sponsors dropped. A junior associate came forward anonymously, confirming he'd known about the bribery, but we were all told to stay quiet. The house of cards was trembling. Meanwhile, my own firm, Valor Interiors, was gaining traction. I hired young female architects and gave them the spotlight Edward always stole from me. Our tagline? Designed by women. Built by power. We got featured in an exposé on rising female entrepreneurs in real estate. I didn't say Edward's name once. But the world connected the dots. And it burned him. The final blow, at least for part 2 of this long game, came at a high-profile city fundraiser. I wasn't on the guest list. Not originally. But one of the organizers, a former friend who'd once told me, I always thought you deserved better, slipped me an invite. Vincent and I didn't walk in this time. I arrived alone. In a structured black gown. Sleek. Powerful. The kind of dress that says, I don't need company to make an entrance. Edward was at the bar. Alone. Samantha was nowhere to be seen. He turned and saw me. And for the first time in months, I saw something new in his eyes. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. He approached cautiously. You're winning, he said. Congratulations. Not yet, I said coolly. But thank you for the motivation. He swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You're turning people against me. Vincent, the board, the press. No, I said, interrupting. You turned them against yourself. I just showed them the truth. He looked at me like he wanted to say more. But I was done. I dropped the final card. The city just revoked permits on your Fifth Avenue tower. You'll get the notice tomorrow morning. He froze. How do you know? Because I'm the one who reported the engineering violations. You should have checked your email before coming tonight. He stepped back, pale. You won't stop until I'm ruined, will you? I raised my glass. Now you're getting it. Justice doesn't always arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes, it walks through the doors you never thought she'd dare enter. Sometimes, it's the voice you ignored for years, now echoing in every headline, every boardroom, every deal slipping through your fingers. I wasn't just his wife. I was the foundation beneath his empire. And now, brick by brick, I was tearing it down. Not with rage. But with precision. With truth. With the power he never believed I had. And I was just getting started. It's strange how quickly the powerful become fragile when the foundation is truth. And they've been lying for years. After the permits on his prized Fifth Avenue tower were revoked, Edward Whitmore's reputation began to unravel like cheap silk. The media called it a surprising fall from grace. But it wasn't surprising to me. It was earned. For years, I stayed behind the curtain while he soaked in the applause. Every award he won for design? My sketches. Every project that wowed investors? My blueprints. He never gave me credit. Not even in private. And now, the truth had a stage of its own. Valor Interiors had become more than a business. It was a movement. Our latest project, a mixed-use eco-friendly development, was backed by Hale Ventures and featured in Forbes as a revolutionary step in sustainable architecture, led by visionary founder Elise Whitmore. The name stung him. Yes, I kept the name. Because I earned it. And because every time someone spoke it, it reminded Edward that he couldn't erase me, no matter how hard he tried. My face was on magazine covers. Panels. Podcasts. No longer the shadow behind the man. I was the woman rewriting her legacy. And every time I got a standing ovation, I knew he was watching from behind his crumbling fortress, wondering how he lost control. He hadn't just underestimated me. He'd weaponized my silence, and now, that silence had turned into a war cry. The city's investigation wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating. Multiple whistleblowers came forward. Contractors, former interns, even a project manager who claimed Edward had forged inspection results for one of their older buildings. That one caught fire during renovations. 2 workers were hospitalized. No one died. But after that article dropped, his investors began fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. Vincent sent me updates almost daily. Your husband's firm just defaulted on its bridge loan. They're bleeding. I didn't smile. Not because I felt guilty, but because I wasn't done. The true core of my revenge wasn't just Edward losing money or buildings. It was him losing what he valued most. Control. 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Not from Edward. From her. Samantha Blake. The Mistress. Her email was polite. Too polite. A forced apology wrapped in passive regret. I never meant to come between you two, she wrote. I didn't know he was still married. I believed what he told me. Then the truth bled through. I didn't sign an NDA when we started dating. If you ever need someone to testify, I know more than you think. Interesting. Turns out, Samantha wasn't just a plaything. She was a liability. And she was scared. So I met her. Not for friendship. Not for pity. But for strategy. She arrived late, looking thinner, paler than I remembered. The spark that once danced in her eyes when she clung to Edward's arm at that gala was long gone. He's not the man I thought he was, she said quietly. No, I replied. He never was. She handed me a flash drive. Emails. Financial logs. He used offshore accounts. Hidden payments. Some even under your name. My hands tightened around the cup. He forged my name? That was the final match. Samantha looked at me. Why are you still standing? Most women would have shattered. I looked her dead in the eye. Because I've already been shattered, Samantha. Now I'm sharp. I hired the best forensic accountant in the city. What we found made my blood run cold, and then hot with rage. Edward had created a shell company overseas 3 years ago. And he used my signature, digitally scanned from older documents, to funnel profits from our joint projects. He was stealing from me. Stealing from the very company I helped him build. And when I realized that, I no longer felt like I was seeking revenge. I was seeking justice. Quietly, I gathered the evidence, drafted the legal complaint, and sent it through the channels that would ensure it made headlines. There was a charity auction a week later. One Edward had planned to attend. I knew he'd be there. He couldn't help himself. The city still barely tolerated him, but he showed up for appearances, clinging to the scraps of his old reputation. This time, I arrived early. Vincent beside me, yes, but only as an ally. This was my moment. Midway through the event, Edward saw me across the room and approached. His face had thinned. The lines around his eyes deepened. His arrogance still flickered, but desperation clung to it like smoke. You're going to ruin me, he said. I didn't argue. He leaned in, voice a whisper. You used to love me. I leaned in too. You used to deserve it. He flinched. You think I can't survive this? I don't care if you do, I said flatly. But you won't survive untouched. I handed him an envelope. He opened it. Read the name of the law firm. The evidence index. The charges. He staggered slightly. You're pressing criminal charges? I stared at him. No. Edward. The state is. I'm just handing them your secrets. He opened his mouth. But I turned and walked away. By morning, the headlines exploded. Whitmore Enterprises under criminal investigation. Wife's legal team leads evidence charge. Betrayed and brilliant. Elise Whitmore sparks financial crime probe into husband's empire. Edward tried to deny it, of course. Claimed it was a misunderstanding. But the evidence was digital. Paper trails. IP logs. Hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. And my name forged on every one. Public sympathy swung entirely to my side. Podcasts dissected my rise. Talk shows praised my composure. Women called me a symbol of silent strength. And Edward? He was summoned to court. His assets frozen. His board abandoned him. And I, finally, filed for divorce. That empire? The one he built on my back? It's ashes now. And from those ashes, I built something better. Not just a company. A legacy. One built on truth, on integrity, on power earned, not stolen. He thought he'd destroyed me when he brought her to that party. But all he did was reveal who he really was. And who I was always meant to become. This wasn't just revenge. This was restoration. And I was only just beginning. The courthouse buzzed with cameras and murmurs. Reporters lined the steps, microphones pointed like weapons, waiting for the smallest reaction. Anything they could turn into a headline. I didn't give them one. I wore black again. Not for mourning, but for war. This wasn't a divorce. It was the final nail in the coffin of Edward Whitmore's carefully curated life. He arrived late. Slick suit, sunglasses, and that same forced smile he used whenever he knew the tide had turned but refused to show it. But the cameras weren't focused on him anymore. They turned to me. To the woman who was done hiding. The woman who no longer whispered. And I was ready to speak. Our lawyers spoke first, but it wasn't long before I was called to testify. I wasn't nervous. The truth was no longer a burden. It was my sword. I contributed intellectual and operational assets to Whitmore Enterprises. I began clearly, my voice steady. My designs became the backbone of multiple high-revenue developments. My signature, which was illegally used to funnel assets offshore, became the tool for his financial deception. The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the documented evidence, emails, financial trails, legal affidavits, all handed over by my legal team. Edward sat across from me, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak. Because there was nothing left to say. His lawyer tried to negotiate. She's asking for 50% of a company that's rapidly declining, he argued. My client doesn't want half, my attorney replied. She wants the truth, and ownership of all properties and projects tied to her intellectual property. The courtroom hushed. Edward looked at me, disbelief clear in his expression. I looked back, indifferent. You built your empire on my back. Now, I'll take the stones you laid and build my own throne. By the time the first day of court ended, the headlines exploded. The divorce that's redefining power plays in real estate. Elise Whitmore takes the stand. He used my name to steal. I'm taking it back. For once, the public was on my side. Influencers reposted quotes from my testimony. Young women sent messages to my business, saying I'd inspired them to walk away from toxic relationships. Some even confessed they were in marriages like mine, where their work was invisible, their voices drowned out. I wasn't just fighting Edward anymore. I was fighting for all of us who had ever been silenced. A week into the trial, the court approved a subpoena for one of Edward's hard drives, an older one that his legal team had conveniently overlooked. The data revealed everything. Timelines of offshore transfers, digital signatures under my name, property reports backdated and falsified. He couldn't hide anymore. And when his former assistant, a quiet woman named Lauren, came forward and testified that he had directed her to alter those files, the courtroom shifted. You could feel it in the air. He wasn't just a husband who betrayed his wife. He was a criminal. The judge postponed the divorce ruling to allow for criminal proceedings. Edward tried to approach me outside the courtroom that day. I didn't stop walking. You're really going to let me burn? He called out. I turned slightly, my voice calm, almost cold. You lit the fire, Edward. I'm just making sure it doesn't go out. But revenge, even when righteous, has its toll. There were nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I ever loved him. How I gave everything to a man who saw me as a stepping stone, not a partner. How I laughed at his jokes while he laughed behind my back. But I reminded myself, this wasn't about hate. This was about justice. About reclaiming what was mine. And making sure women like me never had to rebuild from ashes again. Edward's company stock plummeted. Hale Ventures, with Vincent now publicly backing my firm, took over several of Edward's abandoned projects. One by one, the very buildings I once designed under his name now carried mine. Valor Interiors to lead completion of Whitmore's abandoned riverfront project. Hale Whitmore rivalry ends in Elise Whitmore's corporate victory. Investors shifted. Boards realigned. And Edward? He vanished from the public eye. Samantha had long since disappeared. Rumor had it she left the country. But I didn't care about her. She was just a symptom. He was the disease. 3 months later, the court ruled in my favor. I was granted full ownership of the projects tied to my designs. Restitution for the forged signatures. Edward was fined, sanctioned, and faced additional investigation for fraud. And finally, the divorce was finalized. The judge's gavel hit the block like thunder. Divorce granted. All terms agreed upon. Court adjourned. Just like that, I was free. Not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually. I stood from the chair, straightened my jacket, and walked past Edward one final time. He didn't look at me. But I looked at him. And I said, "This is the last time you'll ever be able to say you were ahead of me." The city didn't just watch our divorce. They studied it. They whispered about it. They rewrote business school case studies about it. Because it wasn't just a scandal. It was a shift. A wife no longer stayed in the shadows. A woman stood in the courtroom not to cry, but to claim. And when it was done, I didn't gloat. I grew. I launched a scholarship for young women in architecture, opened my first international office, and stood on the rooftop of my first solo project, overlooking the skyline I helped build, and whispered to the wind, "You should have chosen respect, Edward. Because now, I own the view." There's something surreal about standing in the same skyline you once built side by side with the man you loved. Only now, his name has vanished from every plaque, and yours is carved into the steel. The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when the headlines started shifting tone. Edward Whitmore's empire dissolves after landmark divorce settlement. Elise Whitmore crowned queen of real estate in stunning rise. The woman behind the man. Now front and center. It should have felt like vindication. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. As if shedding the name that once weighed me down finally allowed me to stand upright, to breathe again. Edward didn't just lose me. He lost the person who believed in him before the world did. The woman who stayed up with him during those lean years, sketching out plans for what would become million-dollar buildings while he drank scotch and promised me forever. He lost the woman who saw past his flaws, believed his lies, defended him in rooms that questioned his ambition. And now, even the city that once toasted his success couldn't remember why they ever raised their glasses. Within weeks of the final court ruling, Edward's financial ruin made national headlines. The SEC launched a secondary probe. 2 board members came forward and testified that Edward had not only falsified zoning paperwork but also used shell companies to inflate investment portfolios. The final blow? His license as a commercial developer was revoked. He could no longer legally run a firm in the state. His bank accounts were frozen pending litigation. And every partner he had once toasted to turn their backs. But the most brutal part wasn't legal. It was personal. No one returned his calls. No one invited him to galas, fundraisers, or investor summits. Even Samantha, who had once dangled on his arm like an accessory, had ghosted him completely. He was untouchable, and not in the way he used to be. Meanwhile, Valor Interiors thrived. We signed 3 major contracts within a month, including an international project in Milan. Young women in design schools started tagging our brand on social media with captions like, "Building like Elise. She did it her way. No more shadows." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was living under anyone's definition of success. I was defining it. Vincent and I still work together, strategically, efficiently, but our alliance remained professional. He respected that I didn't need a man to complete my comeback. He told me once, during a business dinner, "You're the only person I've seen destroy a man without ever raising your voice." I simply smiled. I was taught to raise buildings, not voices. But as with all stories of betrayal and retribution, there's always a final chapter. He asked to meet. I didn't agree right away. He had no right to my time anymore. But something in me, curiosity, maybe closure, agreed. We met at a quiet rooftop bar, one he used to take clients to. It was nearly empty now. The business had faded with his reputation. He looked smaller. Not in size. In presence. The man who once commanded rooms with charm and power now avoided eye contact, as if my gaze might split him in two. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I almost didn't," I replied. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a velvet box. "I didn't touch it." "It's the ring," he said quietly. "Your engagement ring." I looked at him evenly. "And you think that still means something?" He swallowed. "No. I just didn't know where else it belonged." I didn't touch the box. Because the truth was, the ring never really belonged to me. It belonged to a version of me who loved blindly, hoped foolishly, forgave too easily. That woman no longer existed. "You lost everything because you didn't know what you had," I said softly. "You could have had the world, Edward. Instead, you tried to own it." He looked up then, tears glimmering in his eyes, but I didn't flinch. I wouldn't give him what he wanted. He wasn't owed my softness anymore. He stood to leave. But before he did, he said, "They still talk about you, you know. Not just what you built, but how you carried yourself. With dignity. With grace." I met his gaze. "Because I wasn't trying to destroy you, Edward. I was trying to save myself." And with that, I left. A week later, I stood before a crowd of journalists and architects at the unveiling of my first solo skyscraper. It was called the Phoenix. A gleaming, 80-story tower made of sustainable glass and steel. A symbol of rebirth. They asked me if the name had a story behind it. I smiled. "It does," I said. "I was married once to a man who taught me what it meant to burn. And when everything fell apart, I rose. It began with fire, humiliation, betrayal, public exposure. And yet here I was, standing in front of the skyline that once belonged to him, my name shining above the entrance of the tallest tower in the district. Elise Whitmore Tower. 10 stories higher than any project Edward ever completed. People thought revenge meant screaming matches or public breakdowns. But I knew better. True revenge was cold. Measured. Permanent. It was taking everything they said I'd lose and turning it into something they couldn't ignore. And this city? This city watched me do it all. Valor Interiors was now more than a boutique firm. It was a national powerhouse. Our latest merger with an international development group made headlines worldwide. And at the heart of it all? Me. I was now the first female CEO to simultaneously lead both a design firm and a development company ranked in the Fortune 100. The girl who once designed in silence behind her husband now stood alone on magazine covers with headlines like, "She turned her divorce into an empire." Elise Whitmore. From betrayed wife to skyline monarch. The woman who rewrote the rules of power. My team was made entirely of women and men who had once been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. We created spaces that weren't just beautiful. They told stories. Our buildings were a rebellion. Every structure we raised was a declaration. You cannot erase what you didn't build. It was poetic justice when the last building Edward tried to finish, his unfinished crown jewel, came up for auction. After months of litigation, debt defaults, and investor withdrawals, it was handed over to the bank and quietly listed. The whispers began instantly. Will Elise buy it? She wouldn't, right? Too much bad history. But that's the thing about women who rise from ruin. We don't fear ghosts. We build over them. So yes, I bought it. For half the price he paid for it. And I renamed it the Whitmore Foundation Center for Women in Design. A free mentorship and co-working hub for young women in architecture, development, and interior design. The building that was supposed to carry his legacy now carried mine. And instead of serving champagne to the elite, it served opportunity to the underestimated. Exactly 2 years after that infamous night, when Edward arrived with his mistress, and I walked in with his rival, I hosted the gala. In that very building. Everyone who was anyone came. Mayors. Celebrities. International architects. CEOs. And Edward? He wasn't invited. But I heard he came anyway. Watched from across the street. Alone. In a wrinkled suit and bitter silence. Vincent spotted him first. "You want me to have him removed?" he asked. I shook my head. No. Let him watch. Because that's the thing about men like Edward. They need applause. They thrive on attention. But now, the applause wasn't for him. It was for me. When I stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell into silence. I wasn't nervous. I was home. I was once told, I began, that I'd be nothing without the man beside me. That my voice was too soft. That my dreams were too small. That my job was to smile, not to speak. The crowd leaned in. And yet here we are. Not because I shouted, but because I refused to stay quiet. I didn't burn his legacy to the ground. I simply walked away and built my own. Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I stood tall, like the buildings I'd designed. Unyielding. Unapologetic. A week later, a journalist called. They had tracked down Edward. He now lived in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in a distant suburb, teaching evening courses on business ethics at a community college. Irony, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. He refused interviews. No public statements. The man who once couldn't spend a day without press coverage now hid from the very spotlight he used to crave. They asked me if I had anything to say to him. I replied simply, "Tell him thank you." Because without Edward's betrayal, I might have stayed small. I might have dimmed myself forever, just to make room for his glow. But instead, I burned brighter. And now the whole city saw me for who I really was. I never spoke to Edward again. He reached out. Letters, emails, even a voicemail or two. I didn't answer. Because closure doesn't always come in conversation. Sometimes it comes when you walk into a room and they go silent. Not because you broke down, but because you broke through. At the Whitmore Foundation Center, I watched the next generation of women step into rooms I used to be locked out of. Designers from underrepresented backgrounds launched their first startups. Young girls who grew up in shelters studied in classrooms I funded. And every time they asked how it all started, I told them the truth. It started with betrayal, I said. But it ended with me remembering who I was before I was ever lied to. Because that's the greatest revenge. Not watching him suffer, but watching myself soar. He brought his mistress to the party, thinking I'd crumble. Instead, I walked in with his rival and took the room. He tried to silence me. I turned my silence into strategy. He built an empire on lies. I built a legacy on truth. He lost me thinking I was replaceable. Now he lives in obscurity, while I sign skyscrapers in ink and steel. Because when she who walks through fire refuses to burn, she doesn't just survive. She rules.